All right. Well, greetings. It's ISSS Knowledge Engineering. Nice 18s there. We have copied over from last week. So there are some threads that we can return to. However, does anyone want to add anything that's like relevant for knowledge engineering or something that we can add for discussion today? Are there any other updates, especially following the LLM, like Giannis's call for the discussions, or any other pieces that people have continued to like think about or work on? Randall?
Well, just sort of thinking through. I've been working on some things with Gary Smith using GPT-4, developing a series of articles. We had a meeting, I guess, was it last Saturday or so? Anyway, just mentioning it. We're just kind of processing the results of this exercise. I think overall, the folks attending that session were kind of okay with it, and proceeding to develop that resource.
What criteria were you evaluating, or just even thinking about what was relevant when considering whether that was like a useful exercise or how to proceed?
Well, let's see if I can bring up some notes from that.
And I asked just while you're looking, just for this group's purposes, as like we kind of in the direct. Well, first off, one knows Rob Young is not here today. We work with Rob on the archival aspects of ISSS and the Systems Community Alliance. So, but then with this LLM kind of track within knowledge engineering, we are on the more direct side going to be exploring where and how to be applying to the ISSS archives and materials themselves, but then also keeping the systems in mind and just like also thinking more broadly about how such tools and technologies can be used, and how how to start the right way and work the right way in this time.
Right. So so I'm not going to say that we have like a real organized format for thinking through this. It's, other than to say that in developing the prompt, we sort of adapted some of the theoretical concepts that Gary has been working on, and applying that to a narrative or discussion of system science. So it kind of bears on, developing some content and using this tool for developing some content. not necessarily differentiating it from, say, other tools like spell check. That wouldn't be subject to, human review and consideration. But notably, it's it's sort of an exercise in creativity, creative thinking, creative writing, hopefully not too creative, but trying to be accurate and describing our understanding of these concepts.
Any other like thoughts or ideas that people have in this kind of area? It's like using tools, including modern and yet uninvented tools for improving systems, documentation, description, education. We could even sketch some of the flows that we would want to see for the ISSS archival site, like on this kind of archive interface. We could here or with other schematics that Rob may have of like what resources we have, like what are just the flows and the edges that we would want to see, and then what's on our like critical path to provide useful to fulfill the goals of knowledge engineering, which, I mean, the first is just in is the kind of mainly one time, but with maintenance, but mainly one time work of indexing and archiving the ISSS collections. Again, working with Rob on that. However, once that is kind of to a first approximation completed, like we know we have an exhaustive bibliographic index of the ISSS materials, at least at the citation level. And then where it's possible, we have the full text of the materials. That will be the big checkpoint on the archival direction. And then that will then pass slightly more into the education project space with like, now what do we do with that if we have that information? But it's not too early to think from our side like what kinds of processes that we want to apply on the different ISSS materials, or any other topic that's related to this that people want to explore right now.
Well, in reference to what I was just talking about, I think there is a question of developing citations. And this is sort of a questioning response to the whole set of activities in this experiment. In that what I notice is that in developing the prompt and developing some responses to that prompt, or to a variety of variations on a prompt, some text was returned that sort of looks like citations, right? But there was no really further inquiry as to the veracity of those citations. So that's sort of like an open question, right? And it's different from like a normal writing process where, or research and writing process where you're sort of explicitly combing through resources and citing, specific kinds of terminologies and things like that, versus, getting some sort of instantaneous output from this computer system that's rather difficult to evaluate in that perspective. It's not transparent as to where the linkages are, and it would be potentially quite a lot of work to authentically track down those reference materials and track down the passages that are maybe referred to. So, just putting that out there.
Yeah.
And it's sort of like I said, it's kind of an open question.
Thank you, George.
Yeah, I just want to point out, though, that if you're really familiar with the literature base for a subject that you're working on, I would think that you would be able to spot various citations that you knew for a fact were valid, and thereby at least have an initial judgment as to whether or not the output was itself reasonably valid. One of the problems that I've seen, we've run into, is students are very good at recognizing the pattern of a document, of a report or a paper, as far as citations and references and so forth are concerned, and they would just start putting stuff in. Maybe they heard a title or something like that, but there are ways of telling whether or not when someone cites a specific work, whether or not they've actually it's a valid citation. So what this tells me is be really careful about the prompts that you develop. Make sure that you're working in an area where you have some a priori knowledge of that kind of work, so that you can make that kind of a judgment. I mean, this is what you expect of a referee in a in a journal article or something of that nature, that they have enough familiarity with the field that they can, in fact, determine fairly quickly whether or not what they're reading is, especially in things that sound a little strange or have a little different twist than the consensus in the field. You would be able to at least ascertain whether or not the citations come from a valid body of work.
Well, yes and no. There's, I think, it depends on how specific you want to be. And also with, search tools, it's not that difficult to track down sources and things like that. But it is work, and I mean, to try to cite something accurately, and more or less precisely. It's with short passages, making very general statements. I think it's a fair question of like, how much do you need or want to do that? Is it general knowledge, or is it, something very specific to specific authors? Yeah, and there's a lot of judgment in that, I think. And I mean, just with this, very limited exercise, all I can say is that I think there's a lot of potential for, there's a lot of gray area, and there's a lot of questions I think would be hard to answer. And I think, from a sort of serious scholarship point of view, those are things that I think need to be top of mind in these kinds of cases. Yeah, so while you might be able to say, okay, yeah, that's plausible for, reflecting the point of view of authors A, B, and C, but where really did those ideas come from? Or, where are they kind of really strongly cited in the literature? You might be able to have that easily available in your head. You might not, no matter how much you've, been reading into, a body of literature or a body of work.
Well, I think that what I'm speaking to is be careful, or let me put it a different way. The person who's generating the prompt and is looking for an output from one of these LLMs needs to be adequately grounded in the subject matter that they're looking for, so that they can at least make some valid judgments or some good judgments early on.
The problem with that is that's not really practical.
Well, I think it is practical.
Well, I understand why you're saying that, but think about the millions and millions of points of content that go into these models. It's really not practical for any given individual to know all of that stuff. I mean, there are 3 million articles plus written every year that are peer reviewed in scientific journals. Nobody knows all that stuff. And yet it's accessible in a way through these kinds of models. And, and actually tracking down those references, especially maybe where there might be some novel content, stuff you didn't know about, or stuff that you just never read. Yeah, it's it's work. It's work to just to figure that out, and maybe it may not even be feasible on the time frame of a project, right?
Well, I'll just add a few pieces here, like understanding the semantic provenance for where different claims are coming from, and then doing something like cognitive task analysis to help create flows of prompts. Or I always am adding new tools to the tools section, but like these two that I added, the Smallville and the GP team. So these are multi-agent simulations that are using potentially differentially parameterized language models, and they're like hanging out and walking around spatially, digitally, spatially, talking with each other. So we can imagine engineered prompt flows or multi-agent teams where they have different like personalities. Just analyze this text, return the citations and references, and then use web lookup to determine whether it's available on the internet. GPT-4 even this week is extending the web browsing interfacing. So a lot of the specific comment related to like it's inventing citations, it's rapidly becoming a non-issue.
Mm-hmm.
But even if it were an issue, something like that,
Right?
just what would we tell our undergraduate assistant to do? Find all the citations and make 2 lists. Stop. Now with the and just continue on and break these pieces down so that like at any point it can be investigated, and where it's relevant, the intermediate forms can be stored, so that like just like for statistics in a scientific paper, we'd expect a certain standard of reproducibility, like the virtual machine that's able to recapitulate everything. And there's times where like it's just not plausible to share like a large model and store all the intermediate files, but there's times where it is. And so depending on what the just like there are supply chains that have different amount of documentation for physical objects as well. But looking at like the delta or like the challenge or the friction or something that I think Randall and George you're describing, I mean, the very same situation, which is like in the best possible situation, an expert is able to look at the context of a citation, maybe even recognize the last name and the year or something like that. But like those are like the two most finite limiting resources, time and expertise. So expecting that is going to be able to cope with the volume of information it is not broadly practically relevant, but it may be in special cases like absolutely required.
Yeah, so I think it goes to say what is an appropriate level of due diligence in verifying or investigating the outputs of these tools.
Well, for the ISSS context specifically, what would people think about this? Like if we had the archives, we have bibliographic information on every ISSS publication and activity. What are called collections in the Systems Community Alliance by Rob. So we have all the collections ranging from like yearbooks and conferences to online meeting series and newsletters. Collections are just like repeated types of content. So we know the citations for every single of every single ISSS content and collection. What questions would people then or functions would people imagine that would have what level of diligence required? Just within the systems, like the kind of things people are already, like when has somebody found themselves going to an ISSS resource and engaging in some task like that, and what level of due diligence did they just utilize then?
You know, one thing we could do is take a look at publications that have been made in ISSS in the yearbook and or the proceedings from past conferences. Take a look at the citations that were made and track them back to this body of knowledge that are collections, and see how often newer papers actually refer back to older works that have been done. I'd be really curious to know how many people actually are using those collections on a research basis.
That's awesome. This makes me think of, you take the corpus just as it stands and you use topic modeling, so kind of like let's call it pre-23 natural language processing methods and so-called large language model methods, but you develop like semantic and associative networks based upon the topics and the word usage. So papers have some closeness in that semantic space based upon their term and topic usage. Then you have a more traditional bibliometric analysis, like citation analyses. And then it's like, well, there's one world where the semantic clustering is like very much resembles the citation clustering. But there might be papers that are very close in the semantic space that that don't cite each other. Now, if they were published in the same year and it was a similar idea, but they didn't cite each other, that would be understandable. But if we see that there are semantic overlaps that are separated in time that aren't associated with a chain of citations, then the newer work should be investigated for semi-redundancy. That, I mean, depending on a lot of different things, just speaking broadly, but like combining the site, and then also that could be an important measure for success of our project. Like if we improve the visibility and the accessibility of the ISSS archives, we should see the number of papers, number of citations to papers from 1959 probably was 0 in 1958, and then it probably was highest in like the early 60s, for example. And then it on the whole drops off, though some papers may continue to be cited. But if we bring a new level of discoverability to citations from 1959, then if these papers start increasing in their citations again for papers that are either close or distal in the semantic space, then we will be in this little corner of the epistemic environment, be able to say that our knowledge engineering efforts improve the ability of these materials to be discoverable and to have an impact in modern systems science research. Although, and okay, now one related piece is citations are just kind of like the tip of the iceberg, because that's where there's an explicit flagging to another work. However, every generated sentence from a language model, and arguably including human language, has like some non-zero contribution from all of the training set. Like that, so even if a sentence is generated, and it doesn't include like a Smith et al. 1959 at the end of it, valid or invalid, that sentence would have been different if there was a different corpus, because the string is emitted based upon the likelihoods of what it was trained upon in aggregate. So that's kind of like this indirect citation, indirect impact that is much less visible. So to Randall's considerations about like being able to reverse engineer and track back why certain claims or expressions are being made, like if only it was easy as a citation being provided with every sentence, and that sentence accurately conveying the citation or building off of the citation. But it's not even that simple. Like, just to give a concrete example, if we include George's textbook in the training data set, then the word frequency and the co-occurrence and all of this of the textbook plays a non-zero role every time that those terms are used. Like the principles of systemness are more likely to be found next to each other, period, whether or not the citation is provided in the kind of like APA format that we know.
Right. So, you know, if I'm looking at some passage that's been generated, okay, it's based on, you know, statistical likelihoods that relate back to, the prompt and the relationship of the prompt to what's in the database. You could sort of say the same thing about something anyone has written based on what they've read, right? And what's the contribution of that individual to that content, right? Presumably that unique person or the unique author is bringing some non-uniqueness, some information into that process, and we credit them for that. Whereas in these large language models, it's invisible. Like, how do I even know that the works that appear to be cited were actually part of the training set? The training set might actually have been just, little bits and pieces of a variety of content generated by that person, or people maybe critiquing the work of that person. I have no idea. But yet, something plausible it comes out of it. It's just not transparent. But if you want to, try to preserve the integrity of the original works, and that linkage, that's an additional effort, and trying to I think there may be some value in trying to establish what's a reasonable or kind of not necessarily standard set of guidelines to it's not like peer review necessarily, but maybe that's one kind of approach to verifying, validating content.
Yeah, two technical approaches that people are working on, like source tagging and embedding. So just in the training data set, including with some like kind of like direct or cryptically assigned source tag. So like, for example, the transcript of this meeting, the language use would be associated with each would be prepended by the speaker, and so in that way, not all models are able to do this, but I mean, eventually we hope that they will be better at this, that those kinds of source taggings or embeddings would then enable you to say, like, kind of differentiate speakers' perspectives. And so then that versus just kind of blurring it together and being able to, like, I mean, it would, otherwise it does get averaged out without source taggings. So then there could be kind of local coherences that don't, and then one beyond just like promoting coherence in ideation, then any given output token can be said to now sometimes this would be done with like leave one out training methods, but that's probably not possible in this setting. But there's like other ways to do this, where you can understand what is the impact that a source had on this output token. Like from the overall model emitted the sequence A, B, C, and Randall was the one who used B and C in conjunction. So that's why the most likely outcome was B to C. That's why that transition was output. But it's not, I don't believe widely used right now. But indirectly, it basically is, because you can still say like output text by this author or write in the style of this author. So certain attribute, or write as if it was the 1800s. So certain aspects of source and time are obliquely encoded in the models, but this can be made much more explicitly, especially in well-structured corpus like the ISSS archive, where we can explicitly associate like the date that something was published with the speaker. And so we can think about how that can be used to see where these kinds of advances come into play. Like the more structured the text is, generally the better. Not any structure is good, but cleaner, better annotated text is more informative.
Right.
Thank you, Carl. In our like last 8 minutes, I mean, it's interesting. It's also a little fun and different, because we often think more about like the archive itself. So I expect that in 2 weeks with Rob, we'll return to thinking about like that status, but the streams are kind of intertwined. We can already start to draw out the flows, and like with the with coda fields just like this, we can start to explore different things, or people can expand on this, as well as kind of extract or distill. I mean, ironically, of course, we could use language models to do so as well, but people can also process certain things that we're discussing and copy them into a more relevant page. So it's not all just like sort of in the stream of notes. But in the last minutes, does anybody want to bring up any other thought or question? Or Carl, do you want to share any information on the accessibility awareness?
I guess basically just that this is an annual event, so it could set a target for what kind of presence could ISSS have affiliated with CAD 2024, and potentially contribute to the 2024 conference.
Cool. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, a lot of this can be like, really it should be condensed, or at least copied out to the language model page, so that our agenda note taking is a little bit cleaner. But I mean, so there's always just so many interesting threads that come up. Previously, we had discussed Tom's Tom Marzoff's little link here, and the structured inputs and outputs of this kind of system. Haven't proceeded any further with that, but he did send me like the schema that he's using. So I mean, we could also try some experiments like with a sort of GPT for all, like local and offline, or chat with GPT, or chat with PDF, I think, like where you can train it on just arbitrary documents. But we can develop like a little proof of concept. Thank you, Christopher. With even with just George's textbook, it could be related to or anything else you recommend, Shingai, with like just if you're going to cover some section, maybe just we could also explore some interactive way to engage with that. I'm not sure, but just bring up kind of experiments that we can do in knowledge engineering that would keep it like kind of active and keep on bringing things for that would work to improve the system's knowledge environment, but also kind of transfer across. Okay, any last thoughts? Otherwise, that's all good. All right. Thank you, everybody. Talk to you in 1 or 2 weeks or whenever. Farewell.